this computer and share screen again. And there. Right?
Yeah.
Good. Sorry about
that. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks for letting me hijack the seminar for a last seminar this year. So basically, this is an article that's been finished, and I'm sort of working out what to do with next. It'll probably be it's probably going to get submitted somewhere. But so yeah, it's a finished article that basically formed one of the chapters of my PhD, which was about intersections of marriage, slavery, and war, and specifically there's a lot of a warfare component in it. And so this is basically a chapter that I think, and this story is completely fascinating and interesting, but I'm not sure it's going to make the manuscript because it's sort of slightly out of the realm of the thesis. And so that's where this article comes from. And so basically what happened is when I was looking at all of the archives for my thesis and looking about instances of women being abducted for the purpose of enslavement and slavery, I kept coming across the Sierra Leone-Liberia border as a site of conflict. And in fact, the Sierra Leone-Liberia border was also the first place where the RUF invaded during the Civil War. So this is like a continuous site of contention over the border between these two countries. And then I just sort of, in the archives, just sort of, as I was going through looking for stuff on marriage and slavery, just this kind of story unfolded in front of, through the archives over a period of, I don't know, starts in 1860 and finally is resolved in 1917. So over the, I don't know how many years, the story kind of unfolds about how the British and Liberia are trying to deal with negotiations over the border. So it's also looking at questions of, it started off thinking about like how treaties and how borders in Africa were created, and a sort of examination of the Berlin Conference and sort of saying that there's this idea that, Africa is carved up at the Berlin Conference. And then this article is like, okay, well, how did that happen? Like, and I think this is kind of trying to fill that gap where it's like, okay, so Berlin Conference, then people had to go on the ground and literally map the, how do I change? Sorry.
That's fine, you just go. Like that should work, right? Where's that slide?
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Show task file.
Sorry.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Genius.
But it's not going to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So essentially, this is what, so what happens, right, is the countries have treaties that are signed, and then only later on do these border commissions go in and basically map the territory. So essentially, that is what Sierra Leone and Liberia and Guinea look like. And that's sort of, you can see so that's how it looks. And all of it, so 1889 is when the French sign with Liberia. And then in 1892, Liberia loses a huge amount of territory to the French on both the Ivory Coast side and the side. So, but I'm going to get to the Liberia side now, but what is super interesting is all of this revolves around where the source of the River Niger is and mapping the River Niger. And nobody actually knows, at that point, it hasn't actually been mapped properly. And so, in fact, all of this playing out is also trying to find the source. So the story, a lot of it involves like trying to find the correct source of the River Niger and get it, because all of the map hinges on where that location is. And they keep getting it wrong, which means that every single time they get it wrong, all of the borders have to change. And this is what happens in the context of Sierra Leone and Liberia is, in fact, the border, the location of the River Niger is proved to be 30 degrees wrong, which puts a particular town, which is whose chief is a very strong ally of the Sierra Leoneans, in the wrong country. And so that is basically the backstory of where this comes from. So I think there's sort of 2 points that I'm kind of interested in. Is firstly this idea of like how did the drawing of the African continent kind of take place? And there's so many different facets of this that are just completely fascinating, like the drawing of the French Sierra Leone border, literally going around handing out flags to different groups of people saying, well, and trying to work out who signed a treaty with whom, which group, is the line drawn going straight to someone's field, in which case they have to renegotiate because now they can't just have someone's rice field being chopped in half, the border needs to move. But this idea of the British and the French going around, traipsing around the countryside, handing out flags to people to tell them whether they are French or British subjects, I just find really ridiculous. But also, so basically what happens is eventually the border, so this is the area that we're talking about, that the paper focuses on, is that area there. And what basically happens is in 1913, it starts off, and in 1917, the border finally changes. And so this is one of the very few instances where the map of Africa actually shifts. All of this thing about we have to keep the borders, the borders are sacrosanct. This border actually changes. And so this is where the border changes now. So Liberia lost that little portion at the bottom, and Sierra Leone took like the little foot, which is what it is called now. So that's kind of where the story goes. And this sort of takes place for a few reasons, but firstly, I'll give a little bit of a background. So Sierra Leone and Liberia in some ways have similar but very divergent histories. Both of them were colonies set up for previously enslaved people, where those liberated either from slave ships going off to Cuba and Brazil, they're brought back to those places, or in the case of Monrovia, the sort of massive population of freed Africans coming out so Sierra Leone becomes independent, becomes a colony, and in fact, I think the first one, Freetown Colony, is 1808, although I think there'd been a smaller one, there'd been an attempted colonization in West Africa earlier, but Freetown is the earliest at 1808. And then as sort of the 19th century continues and the scramble for Africa picks up, the British then decide to colonize the interior in 1896, only at the conclusion of the French-British border negotiations between Guinea and Sierra Leone. So that also delays the announcing of the protectorates as well. Then introduction of indirect rule, and this is what I also kind of try and engage with in this paper is how the role of individuals within this context of indirect rule. So how individual personalities, individual relationships actually have fundamentally affect something as significant as creating a border. And there's a particular moment in the history of Sierra Leone called the Hut Tax Rebellion, where the British try and force through policy around taxation, and there is a massive rebellion. And so they learned quite a big, I think it gave them quite a big shock as to what happens when you try and force through very unpopular policy, and not have your local elites as allies. And so Monrovia is slightly different. So Liberia, this is where the problem with this article in some ways is that there's so many stories to tell that it gets quite difficult to sort of pin down one story in particular, because then on the opposite side of this is the story of what is happening in Liberia at the same time, which is Liberia is basically bankrupt. It takes out massive loans in 1871 of £100,000, from Britain, defaults almost immediately, mainly because of the terms of interest, corruption. They had to pay a lot of the interest up front. So it's a hugely like the terms of the loan are awful. And so they're sort of reeling with this constant nagging debt. They take out another loan in 1906. Half of that loan goes back to repaying the other loan. I mean, I'll get to that story now, but so Liberia and all of the other colonial powers are circling Liberia. So this is also the story of how Liberia managed to not be colonized, because they were constantly trying to play off Britain, France, and Germany, who all, in fact, tried to colonize Liberia and sort of started approaching the subject of colonizing Liberia.
Carry on. Checking on the computer.
So, and at the same time, so Liberia is under constant pressure over its borders. It loses a huge amount of territory to France, and is constantly having to prove that it has effective occupation in the interior. And so there's that story as well, is Liberia trying to prove that it has control over groups in the interior in order to not lose any more territory to Britain or France. France in particular, particularly nervous about France, which is why they keep signing loan agreements with Britain. So also other thing to remember is this is the 19th century in West Africa, shift to legitimate commerce, hugely violent period, a lot of conflict in the interior. So there's also that component as well, which is with Britain trying to sort of stabilize its borders as well. So basically, so that's sort of the background of all of it. In terms of diplomatic relations, Liberia and Sierra Leone signed the first so weird, the click. Oh, that's because it's not a Mac. Excellent.
It's not a Mac.
Okay. Okay, so here, as you can see, oh, now it's gone.
Just have to share your screen again.
How long have I spoken for?
No. Oh, you've got plenty of time. 10 minutes if you want.
All right. So basically what happens is in this area here that I'm not showing you, I don't think. Does anyone see my screen? Okay. So as you can see in this region, this is the sort of the area, the shoe. And basically what has happened is a very close ally of the chief of the Luawa, which is this area, signed a treaty with the British. Oh, can you not see the?
They can. Oh. Okay, yeah, that's easily fixed. How's that better?
Perfect, yeah.
No, not here.
Not.
But the people in the Zoom can, and everyone knows virtual reality is more important.
Then, yeah.
Very weird.
That's fine. I mean, it's just maps.
Yeah, it's just maps. Who cares about that, right? Okay.
So
carry on talking.
So basically what happens is this chief whose territory is in this little shoe, is a very close ally of the British. He supports them during the Hut Tax Rebellion. Kailaun, it's now Kailaun, it used to be called Kanre Lahun, is a major garrison site for the British. So basically they are using this town very much as a garrison town. But what happens is in 1895, right before the protectorate is about to be signed off, the governor tries to locate the border of Tembikunda, or the source of the River Niger, again. He tries to make it, because they didn't make it the last 2 times they tried to get there. They couldn't. They had to turn back because of the vegetation and the difficulties and all of that. And he finally gets there, although people are still arguing about whether or not it's the right place. But he finds that Kailaun is in fact in Liberia. So they've spent a huge amount, and the Luawa has now been cut in half. So they're one of their greatest allies of the British is now actually in Liberia. And so initially, this doesn't really matter because Liberia had no ability to assert its power in this area or have any kind of administrative control. And so the fact that there was a garrison in another sovereign country, it didn't really matter. But then what happens is, the thing is because there's so much to this, it's difficult for me to go into details of specific conflicts and specific times. But the warfare that is taking place in this region and the British support of Kailondo and his successor Fabundu means that the British are getting lured into and getting drawn into these local conflicts, and in fact in two instances actually send soldiers in to support Fabundu attacking into Liberia. And in fact, in 1905, they send in the Kitty Operation Force, which is basically a military scorched earth tactic, where they send in British soldiers to burn down all of the towns where people are enemies of Fabundu. So there's this almost a civil war there's almost this sort of strange proxy war taking place between local chiefs who are allies of Liberia and the local chiefs who do not want to be in Liberia. They want to be in Sierra Leone, and so are constantly attacking and coming into conflict. And so you have this constant violent tussle. There's a lot of instances of people being murdered, a lot of instances of people being abducted, sold into slavery, towns being burned. There's constant referring to burning of towns. And I'll just read you. And it's also, so the other part of this story is around the issues of violence and colonial violence and why, and trying to understand and get to grips with colonial violence. And I suppose what this paper is arguing is that colonial violence comes from a point of the weakness inherent within the colonial state, and that the extreme levels of violence that are taking place in Liberia and Sierra Leone is also performative. So, and part of the reason why they're so worried and creating the sort of performative levels of violence is because they don't have the infrastructure or the ability to actually control those regions beyond just sort of going in, burning the town, and retreat to prove British prowess. And I'm just trying to find the map. Okay, so eventually in 1907, and there's sort of there's this instance where, in fact, so from 1907, the Liberians, to prove effective occupation, they've taken out another massive loan, have to start trying to administratively control that region. They've also done deals with rubber companies who have now been given a concession over the whole of Liberia. And what's interesting is this is another instance where there's actually conflict within the colonial government, because the concession is given to a British company. And so now there's conflict between the Foreign Office and the British company gives another loan to Liberia. So now there's conflict between the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office, because the Colonial Office is saying, you're taking out the rubber trade away from Sierra Leone. Also, we're stationed in Sierra Leone, we're stationed in Liberia, protecting, our allied chief. And if we are seen to enforce the Liberian Development Company's policy, we are going to lose all support of our local allies, and we're actually then who are then going to basically attack the Liberian development. So they're in this sort of weird position where they're militarily holding a region, but not administratively holding the region. And then, but they also realize that if they support Liberia's claim on the region, there's going to be a civil war all over again. So there's all of these. So then there's a lot of conflict between the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office. So eventually there's another border. They eventually in 19, I can't remember the date, like about 1907, 1908, it is decided the Liberians basically concede that this region is going to be part of Sierra Leone. And so they concede, they are compensated, and also are given that bottom area. So the area switch. But that is not the end of the story, because you have this other individual called Lomax, Mr. Lomax, who is basically a rogue Liberian colonial official who basically takes on this area as like his individual fiefdom. He goes and then his antiques destabilizes the whole area into a point of civil war. And so the border commission mapping the border can't take place. And so they're still with Lomax raiding into what they perceive as British territory. So then they're trying to engage with Mr. Lomax, who refuses to acknowledge the border. Every time they put up the beacons, he tears them down. They take them away, they move them. And so for the next 10 years or something, the border commission, then they employ a commissioner. He's fired. And I mean, the other interesting thing about this is also the climate, because every single time they try to map the border, somebody is sick. Somebody gets black water fever, gets malaria, and is completely out for several months. You can't map this area during rainy season. So they could, but every time they try and map, they lose months on end. Finally, then the First World War breaks out. So all of the British officers have to be recalled. So that puts another hold on it. Then they finally get an American, Mr. Lee, who agrees to take it on. They finally map it. Also, beacons being taken away, pulled down. Mr. Lee is sick for several months. Somebody else gets sick for several months. Then finally, Mr. Lee has signed off on the thing. There's an agreement about the location of the border. There's still certain maps that need to be signed. Mr. Lee has disappears because he wanted to go see something else, and dies of malaria. And so the maps can't be signed. So then only in 1917 is there a final sort of some kind of ratification. And so that's basically the story. But it sort of feels like a story of sort of like one damn thing after another, because it just shows how the British are completely just reacting to sort of one catastrophe after another. And also the way, and I mean, obviously, you know, with sort of levels of hypocrisy. And I love the point, the one story they tell is, you know, we're supporting Fabundu, and, you know, if we didn't support him, he'd be lavishing in a prison charged with treason. And you're like, yes, that's right, because he is currently supporting, you know, allied with a sovereign nation that is not the nation that he lives in. So yes, that is what counts. That is treason. And it's interesting to see how these relationships play out over time. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into how the border between Liberia and Sierra Leone was signed between 1860 and 1885, because that is also another story that reads a lot like this one.
Maybe we'll get into it in questions.
Yes.
Good. Let's swap cases again.
Okay.
And I'll point
So
the
sorry,
camera
like
towards you.
as anyway, yeah. Thanks.
So thank you, Sarah, for a very interesting paper, which I think it has Journal of African History written all over it. But let's get feedback and help from people in the chat, and please raise your hand as per normal. 1 second, I'm just gonna try bring back some semblance of order. Amanda wants to start us off. Amanda? Let's see. I have stopped sharing. Amanda, can you unmute yourself? There we go.
Yes, I did. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for such an interesting topic. And thank you, Dr. Sparks, for this. I have quite a few questions. Now, I know that, Sarah, you were focusing on more on the administrative issues that were faced, or the challenges, administrative issues that were the problems in the borders. Now, my question is, did you look into the way this affected the ordinary citizens? Like, I would assume lived on the borders, or that are actually living on the borders today. I would assume that there's ethnic fluidity there in terms of relationships, intermarriages, family relationships. Did you look into those? And then the second question would be the access to the archives. How easy or difficult was it for you to actually access the British archives as I saw it in your footnotes? Thank you.
Thank you. If you put your chair slightly this way. There we go.
Yeah. It's weird.
It is weird. Yeah, so many things are weird.
So this is what's quite interesting, and it's sort of one of the areas that sort of got me interested in this as well, is like, well, how much did the British administration affect sort of everyday life there? And that's what's quite interesting, is you have this like tension between real administrative control and sort of perceived admin, where sort of things just kind of went on as usual. So I suppose that's also something I'm trying to sort of toy with, is the actual effect of colonial administration on sort of local and ordinary individuals. And it's quite interesting to see how it's used and not used, and how ordinary people's relationship with either Britain or Liberia is used in negotiating the sort of local political economy and local tensions and local conflicts. So I guess that's also what I'm trying to think about in this paper, is how that top level indirect rule, British administration, Liberian administration actually are affecting local political dynamics. And the archive, Sierra Leone archive, so I spent quite a lot of time in Sierra Leone looking at the archive. The Sierra Leone archive is another paper in itself. But it's sort of interesting. My approach to archives is always to start at the beginning and work through all the way to the end. And so you can sort of trace these stories over time. So I've never like just been looked at particular boxes. I've always just pulled out things by year. And so started in 1860 and then sort of went all the way to 1990, but just going through box by box by box by box by box. And that's how you kind of pick out these stories. So you follow characters and you follow individuals, and that's how I sort of got drawn to the story as well, because there's so many sort of very interesting individuals and very strong personalities, and how literally an individual's personality shapes the politics of, international borders. So had Mr. Lomax, for example, been nicer to the British, or had they had a better relationship, this whole situation would be completely different. Another example of this is the Consular General of Britain in Monrovia, Mr. Braithwaite Wallace, was an incredibly rude, awful human being. and there was constantly complaining. And so the way that the relationship between the British and the Liberian government is being filtered through this person who is very anti-Liberia and very rude and awful to, you know, members of the Liberian government. So how much did the behavior of Mr. Braithwaite Wallace affect diplomatic relations? So I guess that's, and you can follow those things in the archives when you sort of do it box by box, I guess.
Linnell? Can you unmute yourself, Linnell?
Okay, so Amanda sort of stolen my questions. I also wanted to know about the archive. I wanted to know, I have two questions and a comment. How did you find the handwriting, or did you have, you know, you must have had handwritten documents, Sarah. And then the other thing is, I found your story about the flags very interesting. So people go marching around saying English today and French tomorrow. So how did that work with so once the border was settled officially, I'm sure those people, you know, how did they react to the whole idea of either being English or French? Or did they? Does it matter? And then the other thing I want to say is, my comment is that I find exactly the same thing in Southeast Africa in terms of the weak colonial rule, and that they have to side with chiefs on the ground because they depend on their alliances or them as allies. So they can't just do what they want. They are sucked into these local arguments. So that's very similar on the East Coast as well. And then the last thing is that you and I should have a chat about the border between Mozambique and South Africa and how that went down, how they determined that. Thanks.
Thanks, Linnell. I think you want to go ahead with that, Sarah, while we wait for hands in the room as well.
So, handwriting. Thank God the Colonial Office of Sierra Leone got a typewriter in 1898. And so before then it's tough. You get into it, right? You get used to it, but things went a lot faster when Sierra Leone Freetown Office got a typewriter. That made me very happy. I think they get their typewriter 1898. It starts to everything be typewritten, but before I think maybe one person had a typewriter. So for future students, when they've got typewriters, that's when you should start your historical typewriters. How did they react to being either French or British? It's so difficult to know, you know, because you're only hearing from the archives, you're only hearing when there's problems, and you're hearing these sort of local conflicts between different groups. So you can only see problems, you can only really see where there are issues arising on the border when someone has read. So there's the story of, this is sort of one of the most interesting moments, and it's another paper in itself, but what happened at Weimar, where French soldiers attack what they think are a group of raiders, and it turns out to actually be British in Sierra Leone, and it turned out to actually be British soldiers. And there's this firing, several people are killed, including the British lieutenant, Lendy, and the French lieutenant is also killed. And I don't know why I'm talking about Weimar. It's because it's sort of this interesting conflict over who is where, what, when, and who is using complaining about being French or complaining about being British, or saying, oh, you know, we're so pleased to be British, we're so pleased to be British. Oh, you know, the French are awful, please let us be British. But that's very much tied up in people's own needs and wants. So it's difficult to kind of assess that. Yes. I think that was...
Yeah. And then now, did Sarah forget something, or are you okay for now?
No, I'm okay. All good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Actually, I thought I might just come in here. Oh, and Faiz is gonna. Great. I think there's a little segue out of the last that anecdote, which I also enjoyed, about the British and the French shooting at each other, thinking they were shooting at rebels. So there were a number of comic aspects to this actually, and a couple of points. My other favorite example is the one where is that the British order people to leave in and go into X territory, but like no one actually knows what, you know, the whole point is that borders are in flux and not at all clear, and so, you know, that's very striking. There are a couple of other things that I think, you know, I suppose I do think you should think about the Journal of African History for this. The only sort of key, I'm not a specialist in this part of the world, obviously, so, but the key text that I thought I was looking for you to cite, you cite a number of key ones that are the right ones to cite, but certainly if you, in terms of revising, for a journal, and maybe especially the JH, Robinson and Gallagher is I think the key one. Britain and the Victorians. No, the Victorians in Africa. That was something like that. Because it's obviously it's certainly one of the texts that makes this kind of argument about how limited British, in this particular case, British colonial power is. But what's striking to me, and maybe this can be one of the twists you put on as you work, kind of finesse your argument, as we are always doing. The thing about Liberia proving that it has control over its own interior, it's hysterical, because no one has control over any interior in South Africa, on the African continent, until, I mean, pick a date. I mean, it's pretty late, and it's certainly not in the period that you're talking about. So there's something about how sovereignty, you use this notion that you emphasize the performativity of British colonial violence, which is absolutely correct. There's also this set of assumptions inside of all of these treaties and these loans and the negotiations around those, where there are assumptions about what Liberia can do as if it were an actual state. But the colonial states, you know, the British don't have that. The French don't have that. None of the colonial powers have that. They don't even have it in their own countries back home, actually, until much later. So it just struck me as like the performativity of sovereignty and power, and so that it's you know, there's Robinson Gallagher, definitely one of the places to go for. Fred Cooper, Higgs, you've got all those citations otherwise. And if I had to just put it as a question, you just referred to the fact that people, you know, in response to Linnell, what do people see being, what are their investments, if you like, in okay, now we're British, etc. And there are places in the historiography, especially in relation, I think, to anti-slavery, where supposedly allegiance to the British is supposed to mean that you have access to ultimately an attenuated form of liberalism, and that's a strong idea people have. I suppose my question is, what are the stakes for the chiefs on the ground? These figures that you described at various points. So this wacko kind of rogue colonial figures there's something novelistic about them. I mean, like this material is so rich, so you must put it in a place like JH. But what I was just going to want you to answer is, what's at stake for the chiefs? So we think we know that how indirect rule worked in relation to that, but there's so much flux and instability in the story. Is it just that it's precisely before a slightly, ever so slightly more settled phase of colonialism actually comes to fruition, or what? I mean, what is the source of allegiance for these chiefs, if any? Or they, like, what do they see themselves getting out of it? Sorry, that was such a long wind.
So the one thing I want to actually talk about is I can't remember in relation to what, but there's an interesting about the performativity and sort of hypocrisy and performativity of sort of sovereignty and treaties and all of that is obviously I mean this article covered the 1860 until 1917, both separate border things. It just wasn't to be, it's too long. But what happens in 1860 is when the first time that Britain realizes it needs a border with Liberia. Liberia has signed all of these treaties with these local communities, and Britain forces a border commission saying, no, these treaties aren't correct, these are bad treaties. But then on the way back from the meeting, goes and signs the treaties with these groups saying, well, we don't have treaties. We're saying that in order to colonize an area, you need a treaty, but we don't have a treaty. So on the way back from telling Liberia that they don't have sovereignty in the area because they don't have treaties, we will sign treaties with all of the groups. So there's sort of this weird, it's almost like international law and international norms go to a certain point, and then it's just, and then basically what happens is Liberia refuses to sign, and Britain arrives in Monrovia in a gunship, in a warship, and it's like, sign. And so that's eventually where it's done. But there was all of this like performativity around treaties and all of that before, but in the end, it was British power and their gunship that got the treaty signed. I think with the idea of what is at stake for the chiefs, I think in this case it's quite stark, because for Kailondo and Fabundu, they signed treaties with the British. They have put themselves as British allies and are obviously reaping the rewards of that through attacks and all of that. But Liberia, being very hostile to the British, would want chiefs put in place who are loyal to the Liberians. So it's the stakes are high, because there's two sets of groups. The Liberians want chiefs in the area who are loyal to Liberia, and Fabundu has thrown his lot in with the British, and so he's basically fighting for his power, because if the British leave him behind, he will lose his seat of authority to chiefs who are loyal to Liberia. So beyond the sort of monetary reasons through taxation and raising like he is tied his flag, staked his flag to the British in a way that, yeah.
So we have a question in the room here, but I'm also, and I see Linnell has raised her hand again. That's not a legacy hand, hey, Linnell. Pfizer first, and then we'll come back to the Zoom.
I think I want to discuss about thinking in relation to the literature of the partition and the colonial partition. In large part because Nigeria was not colonial or run by a colonial government. Big part of the literature is about the relationship between the European colonial powers themselves, particularly in the modern movements, and also the relationship between the metropolitan government and the people who were on the ground in the colonies, whether the trading companies or the colonial officials. So I think, it may be that this case study could be seen as an exception to the general rule that could still reach, simply because Nigeria was not a colonial state, it was a mix. So I wonder if there is another way, or if there is a way that you think through this, that Nigeria this literature, or even maybe to another about the way the border.
I don't know if anyone, did you guys hear that question? No. Sarah, do you think you can faithfully summarize it?
I mean, I can answer it.
Yes. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just answer it.
So this was something that was difficult because I am talking about the colonial state in relation to a country that wasn't colonized, but there is an argument to be made, and I suppose what's interesting is the way that let me think about this. Is part of the reason that this is interesting is because Liberia is not a colonial state, so it is also and is not a European power. It's not invited to the Berlin Conference, even though it's a sovereign nation, even though it's supposedly a sovereign nation in Africa. It's not invited. So it's also about Liberia's insecurity around its own position as well. And it's also about how Liberia sort of manages the space of being the lone non-colonial, like one of the last countries left that hasn't been colonized. And so that's kind of interesting in itself, like looking at the diplomatic relations, not between two European powers. So the question of Liberia in its position as a colonial state, there is a debate to be made about Liberia being a colonial state in itself and it colonizing the interior, because they do implement indirect rule. There is a lot of native administration. All of the sort of hallmarks of what we would see as the administrative structures of a colonial state are implemented in the interior of Liberia. So it's a tough one because on some levels it does fit into that narrative, and the way that the metropole, like the way that Monrovia is interacting with the points in the interior is similar to what we see with like how Freetown is dealing with the interior. So it's something you're right, it's something that I need to think about, is like how to situate Liberia in the paper. But yeah, I think I just stayed away from it because there's so many like moving parts. Yes.
I mean, I think it's actually fighting. It's figuring out the answer to Faiz's question has the makings of a really great paper, I think. I'm looking for any other hands in the room. Yes, Ruslan. And there's a comment or two in the chat which we'll come to as well. Ruslan.
Yeah. This might be relevant to about speaking on, but the unbelievable difficulties they have
So this is a
Sorry.
so I think this was another problem, is that all of these things are so interconnected, because the area is the center point between France, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. It's just like a little point. But because obviously I don't speak French, which is the downfall of many Anglo historians, but I'm using British archives, and so I wanted to not, as much as I wanted to engage in the Guinea, the Franco Anglo-French bound border commission, I could only ever look at it from the English archive. So there is raiding to and from Guinea as well. There is conflict. I mean, if you read the archive of the Sierra Leone Guinea Border Commission, it reads similarly, raiding, conflict. I mean, the Weimar incident was around between the French thought they were in French territory, so they thought they were in Guinea, and were in fact in Sierra Leone. So there's the same, you've got groups allied to the French raiding into Sierra Leone, groups allied to the British raiding into Guinea. So you almost have these like strange proxy wars going on between different imperial powers. I mean, not in the same, but yeah, and these kind of playing out, these like local skirmishes, local conflicts playing out between, Britain and France and Britain and Liberia.
So before going back to the null, I'm just going to the chat. Ji-Young says, Ethiopian historian Sadat Bekele Debele, I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly, has described Ethiopia under Melik II as an off-center empire, akin to nations such as Gacha, I'm going to mispronounce it, it's in the back of the throat. It's a guttural sound in Iran. Those who were not directly colonized by Europe yet led their own smaller colonial projects within their sphere of influence, right? Sort of like sub-empires, I suppose. That's me. The question continues, I'm curious if you would also categorize Liberia as an off-center empire, given the conflict between the settlers of formerly enslaved peoples and indigenous peoples, which is what you were sort of referring to in response to Pfizer, as well as other bordering nations such as Sierra Leone. And I think since we're getting close to the end, Amanda, I think, backed up some of your earlier comments and is full of praise. And revolution, did these border problems carry on into contemporary conflicts in Sierra Leone and Liberia? So if you could try combine, especially the top question with that one.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I do need to theorize Liberia's position in this a bit better. The thing is that I'm nervous about thinking of Liberia as a sort of very insular space, because it's not just about its relationship to the interior, it's about its relationship to the other global powers as well. So yeah, I mean, it's just something I think I need to theorize, think about a bit more. I think in terms of contemporary, yeah, I mean, this is the Luau region remains a real site of conflict. It also remains staunchly allied to the British. There are many rebellions against the rising up against the power of the chiefs who had been put in place, the descendants of Fagundu. And in fact, some of the most vicious fighting during the Civil War and attacks on elders and traditional authorities took place in this region. So it is what Richard Reed, when he talks about it, these sort of like zones of conflict. It very much falls into that category where it's just over a long period of time, it's been almost a continuous zone of warfare.
And lastly, Lanelle, you wanted to come back?
Yes, please. So Sarah, I was wondering if you can't, I know you say there's like 100,000 different parts, but maybe you can split it up into two spheres of authority. So you've got the African authority, and then you've got the English authority and those relationships. And instead of thinking of it as a geographical problem, thinking of it as two different sets of authority that eventually clash. And then I wanted to ask you a very basic question. So why is this border so important? I mean, does it exclude certain things? Does it include certain things? Why is there this fight about the border? That's me. Thank you.
I think the reason I'm very keen to stick to it geographically is because there is a geographical component to it, like a whole border shifts. You know, there's a chunk of space. So there is also sort of a spatial, it's also like geopolitics, right? So it's how the political also links to spatial. So it's more than just sort of two sets of authority. And then the second reason is this is what's so bizarre, is that it's not a very important border. It's a very unimportant border. And yes, there's violence and there's conflict, which means that, I mean, one of the most, there is quite a lot of humor to it, but one of the most sort of chilling moments I find is there's a whole list of people who've been killed in one of the raids, and the district commissioner shows how much taxation has been lost because of the lives lost. So we've lost this much revenue because this is how many people have been killed. That's how many people are now not going to pay taxes. So obviously there is like an administrative component, but it is a deeply unimportant border. And Sierra Leone is like a deeply unimportant colony when it comes to like broader issues of empire. So that's what's so bizarre and it's why it's so interesting that they're getting drawn into this local conflict with these individuals, when the border is like deeply unimportant. I mean, obviously it's important to the Sierra Leone government, but in terms of like broader geographic importance in relation to empire, it's really unimportant.
And yet still interesting.
And yet still, yeah, exactly.
So I think that's a good place to draw things to a close. I want to thank everyone on the Zoom who joined us and everyone in the room as well. And thank you to Sarah for giving us this very interesting story, which I'm sure will find its way into an important place, making a very important argument. So congratulations. Thank you. And if I can only figure out how to do this. God, it's so much easier from my house. Close all windows. Yes, I want to close. Okay.
Okay, cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.
They're gonna leave before I even press end. Go down to the corner. Hey, there we go.
Bye. Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
guys. Thank you, everyone. See you next year.